Megadosing vitamin D has skyrocketed in popularity over the past 3 to 4 years, particularly when it's paired with vitamin K2 and magnesium. But the uncomfortable reality is that there's a distinct lack of evidence of benefit from the clinical studies we have to date. Not only that, there are several worrying side effects from megadosing vitamin D, and there's an important overall learning point we can get from this sorry saga. So what is vitamin D? Vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin that's naturally present in a few foods and added to others. It's also produced when ultraviolet rays from sunlight strike the skin and trigger vitamin D synthesis. But the vitamin D from sun exposure, foods, and supplement is biologically inactive, and it must undergo two transformations in the body to activate it. The active form is called calcitriol. Vitamin D promotes calcium absorption in the gut and maintains adequate blood levels of calcium and phosphate to enable normal bone mineralization. But it's also needed for bone growth and remodeling. Without sufficient vitamin D, bones can become thin and brittle. This can lead to rickets in children and weakening of the bones in adults. But it's not just bones that vitamin D is essential for. Vitamin D receptors are found all throughout the body and has a critical role to play in the reduction of inflammation, as well as modulation of other processes such as cell growth, neuromuscular and immune function, as well as glucose metabolism. The role that vitamin D plays in immune function is one of the main reasons why its popularity has skyrocketed in recent years, and we'll cover that later in the video. The trouble is, many of us have low levels of vitamin D. There are only a few foods that naturally contain vitamin D, such as fatty fish and other animal products. Instead, the primary source of vitamin D for humans is our skin. When UV radiation, specifically type B at a wavelength of approximately 290 to 300 nanometers hits our skin, it enables the production of vitamin D. But UVB radiation doesn't typically penetrate glass, so since most of us are working indoors, we often don't see enough sunlight. And nor should we. UV exposure is one of the most preventable causes of skin cancer and skin aging. But because of these problems with getting enough vitamin D, it's estimated that between 92% of men and 97% of women have low levels of vitamin D. In severe cases, this deficiency causes weakening of the bones, muscle spasms, and dental abnormalities. And there are certain groups of people who are at greater risk of vitamin D deficiency compared to others. For example, older adults are at increased risk of developing vitamin D insufficiency, partly because the skin's ability to produce vitamin D declines with age. Also, older adults tend to spend more time indoors compared to younger people. Other people, such as myself, who always wear sunscreen, are also at risk of low vitamin D levels, as are people who struggle to absorb particular fats. For example, if you've got celiac disease, Crohn's disease, or ulcerative colitis, these diseases cause problems. Finally, people with obesity often have low levels of vitamin D because the vitamin D is stored in the fat cells. But all of this brings up an important question. Since most of us are likely deficient in vitamin D, why don't we all have symptoms of vitamin D deficiency? Well, like I mentioned earlier, some animal products do contain vitamin D. And since the 1930s, vitamin D has been fortified in foods such as milk, breakfast cereals, and margarine. But we don't just want the minimum amount of vitamin D to not get symptoms, we want the best. So what is the optimal blood level for vitamin D? Well, typically in a blood test, it's the inactive form of vitamin D that's measured because it's got a very long half-life and is quite stable. That's compared to the active form of vitamin D, which is generally not a good indicator of vitamin D status because it's got a short half-life, measured in hours, and the blood levels are tightly regulated, meaning that the active form of vitamin D does not typically decrease until the vitamin D deficiency is severe. For the optimum blood level, the Food and Nutrition Board recommend a level above 50 nanomoles per liter. But that's in contrast to the Endocrine Society, which suggests a higher level of 75 nanomoles per liter, which they say is necessary to maximize the effect of vitamin D on calcium, bone, and muscle metabolism. So how should we reach this perfect level? Well, in terms of vitamin D recommendations, even though sunlight is a major source of vitamin D for some people, the Food and Nutrition Board base their vitamin D recommendations on the assumption that people receive minimal sun exposure. So for older adults over 70 years old, they suggest 800 international units, which is also in contrast to the Endocrine Society, which states that to maintain a level of above 75 nanomoles per liter in the blood, adults need to consume at least 1,500 to 2,000 international units per day of supplemental vitamin D. Which leads us to the next question: which type of vitamin D supplement is best? Because there are two primary forms. We've got vitamin D2 and vitamin D3. Most evidence, however, indicates that vitamin D3 increases our blood vitamin D levels to a greater extent compared to vitamin D2. Personally, I supplement between 1,000 to 2,000 international units of vitamin D3 from microvitamin, but remember that just because I take a supplement does not in any way mean that you should as well. We're going to discuss megadosing vitamin D shortly, but first, should we do a vitamin D blood test? After all, we want the best levels. Vitamin D blood tests have become a more common part in routine blood work ordered by primary care physicians, irrespective of their indications for this practice. However, the US Preventative Services Task Force found insufficient evidence to assess the benefits and harms of screening for vitamin D deficiency in asymptomatic adults. It added that no professional organization recommends population screening for vitamin D deficiency. The reason for this is that if a person is supplementing with 1,000 to 2,000 international units of vitamin D, their levels are likely perfect. So in New Zealand, where I practice medicine, the healthcare system won't pay the $60 for the vitamin D blood test because there's no evidence that supplementing with more than that is beneficial, and we'll come to that shortly. Now, that's quite different to the USA healthcare system, where there's a trend to measure everything. Now, of course, it's your health, your decision. If you want to pay for a blood test for vitamin D, go for it. But equally, I've never done it myself, and nor do I think that there's any benefits based on the research that we're about to go through. On that point, what evidence do we have of vitamin D's benefits? The Food and Nutrition Board found that the evidence was inadequate or too contradictory to conclude that vitamin D had any effect on a long list of potential health outcomes, except for the measures related to bone health. There are 8 health conditions that have been well studied in regards to vitamin D, and we'll go through each one. Then we'll finish by looking at the overall important learning point. Starting with bone health and osteoporosis. Bone is constantly being remodeled. However, as people age, particularly women during menopause, bone breakdown rates overtake the rates of bone building, and over time, bone density can decline. However, the evidence of the impact of vitamin D is inconsistent. In a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials involving over 50,000 individuals, there was no evidence that vitamin D prevented fractures. Further analysis concluded with moderate certainty that vitamin D supplementation does not reduce the numbers of falls or injuries. Similar findings were found in 2022 from the VITAL trial. Once again, vitamin D supplementation did not reduce the risk of fractures, which led to the conclusion that following the guidelines and taking 1,000 to 2,000 international units of vitamin D is a good idea for bone strength, but megadosing has no additional benefits. The second proposed health benefit is muscle function. Unfortunately, multiple randomized controlled trials have shown no effect on muscle performance. This is despite the trials increasing the blood NAD to more than 80 nanomoles per liter. In those studies, vitamin D supplementation did not affect lower extremity power, strength, or lean mass. The third proposed benefit is cancer. Laboratory and animal studies suggest that vitamin D may inhibit cancer growth and slow tumor progression, for example by promoting cell differentiation and inhibiting metastases. Vitamin D may also have anti-inflammatory effects. And if you look at the observational studies, where you're observing the population, you do see this trend. Those studies show that low blood levels of vitamin D seems to be associated with increased risks of cancer. These types of studies are often what health influencers will promote as justification for megadosing vitamin D. But in the largest randomized clinical trial, the VITAL trial, which investigated vitamin D and cancer, there was no difference between the vitamin D groups and placebo groups. And worryingly, in a separate meta-analysis of 10 randomized controlled trials, it found an increased rate of pancreatic cancer if the blood vitamin D levels were above 100 nanomoles per liter. All of these lines of evidence led to the conclusion that vitamin D supplements do not prevent cancer. Yes, we might be tricked into thinking that it does if we just looked at the observational research, but from the randomized clinical trials, there's no effect. Number 4 of 8 is cardiovascular disease. Vitamin D helps to regulate the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, vascular cell growth, and inflammatory pathways. Vitamin D deficiency is associated with vascular dysfunction, arterial stiffening, left ventricular hypertrophy, and high cholesterol levels. For these reasons, vitamin D has been linked to heart health and the risk of cardiovascular disease. And just like the cancer section that we went through, if we look at the observational research, we can see a link between low levels of vitamin D and cardiovascular disease. These studies suggest that the risk of heart disease is 10% lower for each 25 nanomole per litre increase in blood vitamin D levels. Again, this is the type of data that health influencers will misleadingly post. Because in contrast to the observational studies, clinical trials provided little support for this hypothesis. For example, a 3-year trial in New Zealand randomized over 5,000 adults to vitamin D or a placebo. Unfortunately, vitamin D had no effect for cardiovascular disease. Those findings were backed up from the VITAL study, which also found no effect from vitamin D supplements with respect to heart attacks, strokes, or deaths from cardiovascular disease. Crucially, these effects did not vary by the baseline levels of vitamin D in the blood. Overall, the clinical trials show that vitamin D supplements do not reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, even for people with low blood vitamin D levels. Number 5. Depression. Vitamin D is involved in various brain processes, and vitamin D receptors are present on neurons in areas of the brain thought to be involved in depression. Again, we can get tricked by the observational research, so when we observe the population, we do see that yes, people with low levels of blood vitamin D seem to have higher rates of depression. The clinical trials, however, do not support these findings. For example, a meta-analysis of 9 trials involving just under 5,000 participants found no effects in the symptoms of depression with vitamin D supplements compared to a placebo. You see the theme, don't you? Good levels of vitamin D are a marker of good health, but they don't seem to be the cause of good health. If we think about this a different way, all world champion drivers wear helmets, but if you or I put a helmet on, we're not going to magically change into a world champion driver. It's the same for vitamin D. If people have good levels of vitamin D in their blood, they're likely practicing other healthy habits, such as going out for a walk, looking after themselves, having a good diet, and yes, the occasional supplement. Number 6 of 8 is multiple sclerosis, or MS. MS is an autoimmune disease of the central nervous system that damages the nerve cells. Interestingly, the geographical distribution of MS around the world is unequal. People who live near the equator have a lower chance of developing MS compared to if you're further north or south. And while there's still work to be done, the clinical trials so far where they test this idea have been disappointing. Overall, vitamin D supplementation, when compared to a placebo, had no effect on relevant clinical outcomes, such as recurrent relapse or worsened disability. Number 7 is type 2 diabetes. Vitamin D plays a critical role in glucose metabolism. It stimulates insulin secretion via vitamin D receptors on pancreatic beta cells and reduces peripheral insulin resistance through vitamin D receptors in the muscles and liver. Just like all the other examples, observational research suggests a link between low vitamin D levels and type 2 diabetes rates. But in a meta-analysis that combined 35 randomized controlled trials involving over 40,000 individuals, vitamin D had no effect on insulin resistance or HbA1c. In the largest trial to date of vitamin D supplements for diabetes prevention, which randomized 2,423 men and women, unfortunately, vitamin D did not prevent the development of diabetes compared to a placebo. But that study did find something interesting. Further analysis of that study showed a 62% lower rate of diabetes among participants who had low levels of vitamin D and who took vitamin D supplements. Once again, supplementing with 1,000 to 2,000 international units of vitamin D is probably a good idea, but more than that, there's no benefit. The final area of interest is immune response. Because vitamin D receptors are found on immune cells, it's thought that there's the potential to improve immune responses. And yes, there is some evidence for this idea. A 2017 systematic review and meta-analysis of vitamin D supplements found that supplementing with vitamin D at the recommended doses resulted in a 12% lower risk of developing upper respiratory tract infections compared to a placebo. A subsequent meta-analysis found the same thing. So while it's a good idea to supplement in line with the Endocrine Society recommendations, there's no evidence of further benefit from megadoses. I also want to speak on the idea of pairing vitamin D with vitamin K2 and magnesium. This is exactly what I do as part of microvitamin to help reach my recommended daily intakes of these micronutrients, but currently there's no evidence that megadosing any of these vitamins or minerals offers further benefits beyond reaching the recommended daily intakes. Instead, we do have evidence of harm from megadosing vitamin D. Because vitamin D increases calcium absorption in the gut, vitamin D toxicity results in marked high levels of calcium in the blood. This causes nausea, vomiting, muscle weakness, pain, loss of appetite, dehydration, excessive thirst, and kidney stones. In extreme cases, vitamin D toxicity causes renal failure, calcification of soft tissues throughout the body, cardiac arrhythmias, and even death. The overall lesson from going through the vitamin D research is to be incredibly skeptical about anyone promoting high levels of vitamin D. They will often extrapolate findings from observational studies as justification to megadose vitamin D. That is incorrect. We need to look at the randomized controlled trials. Instead of getting distracted by megadosing vitamins or minerals, we need to focus on the fundamentals of health: diet, exercise, and sleep. And yes, certain supplements can be used to help us reach the recommended daily intakes of various micronutrients. So I use microvitamin to do this, and I designed microvitamin to make sure that I don't megadose. But again, just because I take a supplement does not in any way mean that you should as well. And make sure to check out this next video here on all of the strategies that you can use to optimize your sleep. And thank you to the patrons supporting the channel.